hear so much about what happens here, and I have so much love for this congregation. But through the years, one thing has never changed, and that is when I come into church and I see the number 683 on that board over there, I know exactly who's leading singing. It's good to see you too, Phil. This morning, I want to talk about God's outrageous idea to save the world, God's outrageous gospel. And I want to use as our text this morning 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18 through 2, verse 5. And I want to begin just by reading that text. I am reading from the Christian Standard Bible this morning. It says that, "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but it is the power of God to us who are being saved. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will set aside the intelligence of the intelligent. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made the world's wisdom foolish? For since in God's wisdom the world did not know God through wisdom, God was pleased to save those who believe through the foolishness of what is preached. For the Jews ask for signs, and the Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews, and foolishness to the Gentiles. Yet to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God, because God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Brothers and sisters, consider your calling. Not many were wise from a human perspective, not many powerful, not many of noble birth. Instead, God has chosen what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God has chosen what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God has chosen what is insignificant and despised in the world, what is viewed as nothing, to bring to nothing what is viewed as something, so that no one may boast in his presence. It is from him that you are in Christ Jesus, who became wisdom from God for us, our righteousness, sanctification, and redemption, in order that, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. When I came to you, brothers and sisters, announcing the mystery of God to you, I did not come with brilliance of speech or wisdom. I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. My speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not be based on human wisdom, but on God's power." The word of the cross is foolishness. What does that even mean? Why would an apostle of Jesus Christ write such a thing? The word of the cross is foolishness. In this lesson, I want to look at 3 foolish ideas that Paul develops in sequence about the gospel, about the people that he's preaching to, and about the methods that he uses. And at the end, I want us to make some applications about the outrageous way that we are to apply this to our lives. God's outrageous plan to save the world. God's foolish plan to save the world, we might say. And to start with, we have the idea of a foolish message. A foolish message in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 18 through 25. The word of cross is foolishness to the perishing. What an absurd idea. Can you imagine the conversation? God, the world is so messed up. What are you going to do to fix it? How are you going to save the world? Well, I'm going to send my son into the world to save it. Oh, well, that's a good idea, God. I'm sure that will work out nicely. No, I'm going to send my son to die by crucifixion in saving the world. Well, I didn't see that one coming. How is that supposed to fix anything? How is that supposed to make it better? How is that supposed to make it right? In just about every high-class, high-powered sphere of life, this seems like a terrible idea. People who look at life as a zero-sum game, they're not going to get it. Smart people and scholars in their ivory towers, they're not going to understand submitting to that. Rich people, they're not going to understand someone throwing away the glories of heaven and leaving the throne and all of its glories to come down to this mess. The chief priests, the scribes, and the Pharisees would look on it and mock it. He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Who thinks this way? Win by losing. Give life by dying. Save by perishing. Achieve glory through shame. Crucify the Messiah. Now, you hear the phrase crucified Christ. We have to be careful here. Crucified Christ sounds kind of catchy, right? People, it's got a little alliteration to it. Today, people might dress it up in a little pretty garb, painted in murals and incorporated into stained glass artwork and wear it as jewelry. I'm not going to comment on the rightness and wrongness of those things, but I am going to say this, that if you lived in the first century and you were there when Jesus was crucified, you would be confused and bewildered by the idea of the cross as decoration. Because the cross was grotesque. It was disgusting. It was shameful. The cross, there's this Roman lawyer who's on record as basically arguing we shouldn't condemn them with crucifixion because that's not acceptable dinner table conversation. Because that's not polite conversation, in other words. It's so messed up. Can you imagine if you went into a church and they had a mural on the back wall and it was something like the Hiroshima explosion? And you go, what kind of weird place have I walked into? What kind of disturbing, bizarre group have I gotten involved with? That's the sort of thing that ancient people would have thought when they thought of the cross. What kind of cult have I joined up with? Visitors might recoil a little bit. That's weird. That's cringy. Why celebrate something so awful? It's foolishness to those who are perishing. But, Paul says, to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. To Paul and to the Christians, there is a defiance of the social stigma. To Paul and the Christians, it is something to be celebrated. It is the thing that is boasted about. It is the thing that essentially becomes decoration in history. It's the instrument of torture and execution becoming a symbol of victory. The brutally executed Messiah of ours becomes our good news, our gospel. The thing that caused the world to look at the Son of God and say, well, he's weak because he can't even save himself. That's actually the power of God. That's not weakness. Paul quotes from Isaiah 29:14 here, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will set aside the intelligence of the intelligent. In the context of Isaiah 29, he's talking about how God is going to do something so wondrous, so marvelous, so transfixing. God is going to take every bit of human wisdom, every bit of human cleverness, every bit of we got this figured out, and he's going to destroy it. He's going to break it down and put it in its place where it belongs. In the context of Isaiah 29, which is like 700, 800 years before any of this, they're having an argument in Judah about whether they should go to the Assyrians for help or whether they should go to the Egyptians for help. They're kind of sandwiched between these two great superpowers on the east and the west. And there's this big empire taking over the world, and there's a push in King Hezekiah's court. Maybe we should ally with the other big empire to kind of push back against them. And they're having this argument, if you don't support Egypt, then Assyria is going to win. And you don't like Egypt, but they're really kind of the lesser of the two evils that we're choosing between. And you don't really want to end up on the losing side, do you, Hezekiah? And all these arguments. And the people are still paying lip service to God all the while that this is going on. And they're still talking about how, well, yeah, sure, we believe in God, but don't you think that God helps those who help themselves just a little bit? And don't you think that, you really should be, doing some of this other worldly wisdom stuff to kind of help you out? And in Isaiah 29, God says, Isaiah 29, in verses 13 and 14, that this people approaches me with their speeches to honor me with lip service. Their hearts are far from me, and their human rules direct their worship of me. Therefore I will again confound these people with wonder after wonder. The wisdom of their wise will vanish, and the perception of their perceptive will be hidden. God says that all that reasoning that you guys are using to go to the Egyptians, all of that is trash. God is so big and so strong and so smart that he can basically squash any human plans involved in the story. He can thwart any human effort that you come up with. You think calling on Egypt will work? I'll make it not work. You think Assyria's plan to sack Jerusalem will work? I'll make that not work too. And if you know the story, you know what happens. The angel of the Lord shows up and devastates their army. Because that's how God operates. He doesn't give victory to the biggest army. He doesn't give victory to the best planner or who has the best management of resources. You know who gets the victory? Whoever God says. That's who. That's the point. God can do the weakest, most foolish thing in the world and still win anyways. Because he's God. God's foolishness is wiser than all the wisdom we could come up with. And God's weakness is stronger than all of the military might that we could muster. Why the cross? We can give a lot of reasons for the cross. Atonement for sins, victory over death through death, sympathy for our weaknesses, setting an example for us. But if Paul is to be believed in 1 Corinthians 1, one of the reasons for the cross is to make you ask why. To make me ask why. I mean, think about it. Well, that might be one of the reasons for it right there. It's because no one saw it coming. The devil didn't see it coming. If he had, he wouldn't play it into God's hands. It was the last thing the world expected God to do. They thought God was like them. Humanity thinks God is like them. Obsessed with winning. God proves that you don't need to be obsessed with winning to defeat death. Okay. So the cross is a foolish message. But I want to pause here before moving into this next bit and ask ourselves this question. What's the point? Is Paul telling us that the gospel is a big, ha-ha, we're smarter than all the smart people moment? Is that the point? Because if you read it the wrong way, it just becomes another reason to be smug at people. Oh, you think you're the smart ones, because we're the smart ones, because we believe in Jesus and go to church. And I think that there's some believers that really do go that direction with reading that. But does that make it right? We need to step back and ask ourselves why Paul is saying this to the Corinthians. Is he saying this to the Corinthians so that they can pat themselves on the back? You guys got the right answer when everybody else in the world was too dumb to see it. Well, if you read 1 Corinthians, it becomes clear that Paul isn't exactly very happy with them at all. And it becomes clear, in fact, that the Corinthians are kind of messed up. They have divided themselves into factions centered around cults of personality. I am of Paul. I am of Apollos. I am of Cephas. I am of Christ. They're actually boasting about who baptized them. And it becomes clear from reading 1 Corinthians that you have a group of Christians that is super preoccupied with how knowledgeable they are, and how wise they are, and how spiritual they are. And when Paul writes this bit about how the gospel is a foolish message that invalidates the wisdom of the world, he's accusing the Corinthians, he's accusing the Christians at Corinth of buying into the worldly wisdom, of possessing that very worldly wisdom which contradicts the cross. The issue is not that they don't believe the gospel. The issue is that there's something about the way that they are living the gospel, the way that they are acting in their community, the way that they are practicing the gospel that looks just a bit too much like, well, the wisdom of the world. Which is why I think he goes even further, and this is the insulting bit, when he says it's not just a foolish message, it's also a foolish people. That's the second one. It's a foolish people that we're talking about, the Corinthians. Consider your calling. Not many wise from a human perspective. Not many powerful. Not many of noble birth. You guys aren't that special. You think you're so smart? You Corinthians were the dumb choice. They didn't have any wise, at least according to the flesh. And they didn't have many strong or noble people among them. But you know what God did? God chose them anyway. God loved them anyway. God saved them anyway. God has a history of that. Of choosing the losers. God chooses people to accomplish his purpose that you and I would never think of. He hires people for jobs that wouldn't even make it past my first interview. He chose Abraham, childless shepherd, told him to move to a totally different country, get away from his family upbringing. I'm going to bless all the nations through you. He chose Jacob, a man who had a habit of swindling and deceiving, who had to eventually be beaten up by an angel to go own up to his errors. He chose Moses, murderer, slow of speech, slow of tongue, afraid to fulfill his commission, practically had to twist his arm at the burning bush to get him to go do what he was telling him to do. He chose the judges. Have you read the book of Judges? Most of them were unsavory characters. He chose David to rule Israel, a guy who goes on in his career to break over half the 10 Commandments. He chose Judas to handle the money box. What is Judas known for? Being a betrayer, but also a pilfering thief. He chose that guy to handle the money. And if anybody other than Jesus had done that, most people I know would be yelling about how irresponsible that was. and how, you should have vetted him better. God makes foolish choices when he chooses people for things. Why does he do that? These guys aren't the exception. These guys are the pattern. These guys are the rule. The Lord did not he says to Israel, the Lord did not set his love on you nor choose you because you were more in number than any of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your forefathers, the Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Deuteronomy 7:7 and 8. Do not say in your heart, when the Lord your God has driven them out before you, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. It is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. It is not for your righteousness or for the uprightness of your heart that you are going to possess their land. It is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is driving them out before you, in order to confirm the oath which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Deuteronomy 9:4-5. When we say the cross was the epitome of foolishness in the eyes of the world, we're not saying, this is that one exception to an otherwise pristine record of God using the best and brightest. No. It is the very chief example of the rule. God uses the foolish to shame the wise. God uses the weak to shame the strong. God uses the despised to shame the honor. God uses, I love what the NASB does here, the things that are not, so that he might nullify the things that are. God can take stuff that we wouldn't even think of, stuff that doesn't even exist, and still win with that. Can turn all of our accomplishments to dust with a mere thought. Can checkmate you without even looking at the board. That's who God is. And so all of this talk about how God nullifies the world's greatness is designed to do one thing. In verse 29, to obliterate our reasons for boasting, so that no one may boast before God. No one may boast in his presence. The Corinthians were not in the position they were in with God because they were stronger or smarter or more noble. They were in his position, as we talked about in class, by his grace, by his doing. By his doing, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us as wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. He is our righteousness. I will look upon the Lord. He is all my righteousness. He will make his face to shine on me. They weren't chosen for their goodness. No. Israel wasn't chosen for their goodness. The Corinthians weren't chosen for their goodness. We're not chosen for our goodness either. God became their goodness, washing them, cleansing them, sanctifying them. And if that's true, if it's not my goodness and God's goodness, then what have I got to brag about? We've got nothing to boast about, save boasting in the Lord. As the Lord said through Jeremiah long ago, let not a wise man boast of his wisdom. Let not a mighty man boast of his might. Let not a rich man boast of his riches. But let him who boasts boast of this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who exercises loving kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth. For I delight in these things. Jeremiah 9:23-24. Okay, fine. We get it, Paul. We didn't deserve grace. We didn't deserve to be saved, but God saved us, and he did it in an unexpected way that nobody in the world would have seen coming. So we shouldn't brag about anything except the Lord. We get it. We get it. Or do they? Or do we? Paul goes further. And this is the don't let the chapter division fool us now, because we keep going into chapter 2. I came to you, brothers. I'm announcing the mystery of God to you, and what did I not come with? Did not come with brilliance of speech, did not come with brilliance of wisdom. Paul showed up with the gospel. How did he win them over? Did he win them over by intellectual sophistry, his great rabbinic learning, his knowledge of Greek philosophers, his mastery of rhetoric? No! Paul had one aim when he taught them. Know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Paul didn't, and this is where we get to the third thing, the foolish methods. You've got the foolish message, you've got the foolish people, now you've got the foolish method. You remember how he showed up at Corinth in Acts chapter 18? What he was doing, what happened? Let me just read this real quick. In Acts chapter 18, He left Athens, he went to Corinth, where he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul came to them, and since they were of the same occupation, tent makers by trade, he stayed with them and worked. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade both Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself to preaching the word and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. And when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook off his clothes and told them, "Your blood is on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." So he left there, went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord along with his whole household. Many of the Corinthians, when they heard, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in a night vision, "Don't be afraid, but keep on speaking. Don't be silent, for I am with you. No one will lay a hand on you to hurt you, because I have many people in this city." He stayed there a year and a half, teaching the word of God among them. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack against Paul, brought him to the tribunal. This man, this man, they said, is persuading people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. So look at that. Let's just get kind of the catalog of things. He shows up at Corinth. He's moonlighting as a tent maker. He persistently avoided taking Corinthian patronage, although he took money from other churches. You get the whole bit from Macedonia. He stops being a tent maker when Silas and Timothy show up to help. At one point, he got booted out of the local synagogue. At another point, he got dragged before the local proconsul. You get arrested and dragged into court. Is this the sort of guy you want preaching in your church, by the way? Someone he's branded as an out-of-town troublemaker and who had to go to the local courthouse because he's been labeled as a disturber of the peace. Like, we might pass on this interview and go talk to somebody else now, right? And this is kind of take a safer option. And yet, in spite of all of it, what does Paul say? I was with you, 1 Corinthians 2. I was with you. I came to you in weakness. I came to you in fear. I came to you in much trembling. You see the kind of stress that goes into just getting this congregation even started. And Paul's message, it wasn't this soothing to the ear masterwork of public speaking. Oh, no. His message was that simple, foolish message. Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Paul would later be criticized at Corinth because his speaking ability wasn't up to snuff. His letters are weighty and strong, but his personal presence is unimpressive and his speech contemptible. 2 Corinthians 10:10. Can you imagine that was said about the Apostle Paul? I mean, to be fair, all we have are his letters. We've never heard him speak. But the world looks at Paul and says, that's not enough. The packaging that his gospel comes in isn't pretty enough. And it's not just that the word of the cross is foolishness, though, that God would win by losing. And it's not just that the people that the gospel appealed to were foolish, like the Corinthians, that God would choose the losers to win. It's that the gospel engages in foolish methods to spread itself. That God picks losing strategies to promote His word in the world. And that's not a bug in Christianity. That's a feature. This is the God, you look at the pattern of history. This is the God who, upon the Exodus, leads Israel into an ambush, trapped between the army and the sea. Why? So He can demonstrate His power. This is the God who had Israel trek in the desert to places where there was no food and no water. This is a God who told the Israelites to capture a walled city by marching around it 7 times. Once a day for 6 days and 7 times on the 7th day. But, it tells them to march around the city. That's not how you take cities. The God who told Gideon to kick people out of his army until it was too small to possibly stand a chance. The God who sent His Son, God incarnate, true God of true God, and let them spit on Him, beat Him, mock Him, crown Him with thorns, strip Him naked, and nail Him to a tree to die. This is a God who chooses losing strategies to save the world. How outrageous. And we hear all that, and we hear that's how God wins. We really think God's purpose is going to be undone because somebody is a poor public speaker? Do the Corinthians think that? Do we think that? So that's a foolish message, a foolish people, a foolish method. But I want to talk applications now. The outrageous things that this should do to us, because it's easy to beat up on the Corinthians. I want to invite us to look inward. I think the Corinthian church has more in common with modern day churches than most modern day churches want to admit. Many of them, you think the Corinthians were pretty well-to-do. They were wealthy enough to contribute to the benevolent aid described in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. Wealthy enough to have money to offer Paul, which he refused. Wealthy enough for Paul to get on their case about how they treat poor people in 1 Corinthians 11. The Corinthians were self-reliant. They seemed to be very confident in their spirituality. I sometimes joke, are we sure this isn't First Americans? God did something outrageous in the gospel here. How can we live out that outrageous message? I want to suggest 3 applications I would make for myself and hope they can spark some thought for others. Number 1, talking about the idea of outrageous acceptance. Outrageous acceptance. God's history of choosing the losers means we should consider imitating his choices. Oh, he wouldn't be interested in the gospel. That's not a phrase that should be in our vocabulary, ever. Our experience with God's grace ought to disabuse us of the idea that only perfect people get it. Why did Jesus eat with tax collectors and sinners? Did he eat with them? Why choose uneducated fishermen as disciples? Why invite a zealot and a tax collector to be part of this group and sit at the same table? Because God's glory is most fully allowed to shine when the people it shines through have nothing to boast about on their own to get in the way. Where are the tax collectors and the sinners of our day? Yeah, I know, it's like, well, Jesus invited tax collectors and sinners, and of course there's the whole, we like to kind of jump in with that qualifier, but of course Jesus made sure to tell them that tax collecting and sinning was bad, that extorting people was wrong. We need to have a whole conversation about that before we have them to the table. Let me ask you a question. Who hated sin more than Jesus? I don't know anybody who hated sin more than Jesus. Who loved those tax collectors and sinners more than Jesus did? They were drawn to him. They are drawn to him because of his compassion. And the question I have to keep confronting in myself again and again, is why aren't such people drawn to me? What am I missing that Jesus had in himself? Well, there's a lot of things Jesus had that I'm missing. But one thing I think is the wrong answer. Oh, well, they just don't want to hear that their sins are wrong. Well, that wasn't it. Nobody hated sin more than Jesus did. How about us? Do we invite them to eat with us? The outrageous acceptance. I wonder if I've spent so much time hand-wringing, how do I tell this person all the things that are wrong with their life, that I forget to show them what is right and good in Christ. That message of the cross that saves people. Outrageous acceptance to that end. Second, outrageous perspective. Outrageous perspective on what works and what doesn't work, we might say. The world loves to organize stuff in these huge top-down structures. It's not enough to just quietly share the gospel with your neighbor. It's not enough to just quietly help the poor. You got to have an efficient, well-oiled machine that's centralized and overseen, well-funded. You got to make sure you put your polished speakers up on the front lines. You got to make sure you have the best graphic designers putting your material together. You got to make sure that you have the most educated teachers. And here's the rub. Your little church, I go to a little church. This church is much bigger than the one I attend. Our little church might not be able to do anything, but we can put our money towards some great thing, right? Great things indeed. Why do the small things when you can do the great things? There's just one small problem with that. What does Jesus say about the obsession with greatness? The one who wants to be great among you must become least, must become last of all. I see this on the internet sometimes. We get a bunch of preachers together, and this question gets floated: who do you think the greatest preacher today is? Who do you think the greatest preacher alive today is? I've seen this multiple times, and I just about want to blow a gasket when I see it. Because first of all, the greatest preacher alive today is Jesus, resurrection of the dead. Perks of being raised from the dead. But secondly, cult of personality devotion to preachers is weird and wrong. And stop it already. The best preachers that exist are going to be people that you and I have never heard of because they live unsung lives out of the limelight. And third, accepting what's in the Bible, the greatest sermons ever preached are probably preached in churches, and then the audience that hears it, relatively unknown, never published. And some of the best proclaimers of the gospel may have never stood behind a pulpit or on a stage. Or maybe just that person who goes and quietly shares the gospel with their neighbor and shows them the compassion of Jesus in their lives. Maybe that person's the greatest preacher alive today, besides Jesus. I know for a fact it ain't me. I'm just some guy. I won't get mad if people tell me good job, but in my mind, the most important thing is whether the lesson helps you and helps you in your faith and whether God is glorified in what's said. But I should be mindful of what the Lord told Samuel. Don't look at his appearance. Don't look at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. God sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And I dare say something like that applies not just to how a person looks, how a person speaks, how a person sounds. The Lord isn't looking at the externals. The Lord is looking here. He's looking at the heart. Outrageous perspective. And then third, outrageous trust. It can be difficult. It can be difficult when I do all the stuff that I feel like I'm supposed to have done, and then results don't happen. Or things get worse. I have been frustrated in my life with this sort of thing. I'll plan stuff out meticulously. Here's everything I need to say. I'll do all the research. I'll listen. I'll respond in a way that I think is seasoned with salt. I speak. I sacrifice. And you know what happens? Things stay the same and they get worse. And my first instinct is to do what? I'm going to try to beat myself up over it? I didn't do enough. I didn't do it right. What could I have done differently? And self-evaluation can be healthy, sure, but self-reliance is not of God. How can I claim to be a proclaimer of a gospel of grace and a servant of God who triumphs over human inability if I put so much of the onus on, my own abilities? And if I had succeeded, would I have said, it's because I did all the right things. It's because I said all the right things. It's a good thing I was so prepared. That misses the point entirely. Outrageous trust. Outrageous. How is that not boasting in self? How is that not boasting in human wisdom? You think about this is every sphere of life. This isn't preaching. This is raising your children. If my kids turn out well, will it be my doing? Or will it be God acting in spite of my faults? My failures as a father. I don't have parenting figured out at all. If my kids get where they are, if my kids get to where they need to go, it will be because of the grace of God. And if we have an edifying assembly together at church, it will be because of God, who makes us feel all edified in spite of whatever clunky social awkwardness I managed to introduce into the equation. No. Paul's message in 1 Corinthians means anything. It means I need to take myself out of the equation and rely on outrageous trust. Take myself out of the way of the gospel and trust in the power of God to transform the lives of other people around me. That's basically the idea in a nutshell. That's God's outrageous gospel. God proclaimed a foolish message in the cross. God used that message to save a foolish people. God proclaimed that message through a foolish method. And that brings us where we are. Take out your song. Well, not take out your songbooks, I guess so. Take out your songbooks if you still use them. If you still use them. I like songbooks, personally. The whole thing seems outrageous, and it should drive us to some outrageous conclusions. An outrageous acceptance of others, a willingness to love others and see them come to Christ. An outrageous perspective on the talents and the methods around us, realizing that God is most often glorified through those who are acting in the quietest and meekest of ways. And an outrageous trust in the Lord, one who realizes that success and growth is not chalked up to our own planting and watering, but to the God who gives increase. Now, if you're here this morning and, well, you are not in Christ, or you have strayed from Christ, or whatever the case may be, and there's a way that we can help you be one with the Christ who gave himself to save this world and to save you. If there's anything we can do to help you along that path, now is an appropriate time to let it be known. All together we stand and we sing the song selected.